If you had told me 8 months ago that I would one day be a fugitive from my own son, hunted through the streets of my own city, I would have told you that grief had finally taken your good sense. I was 72 years old. I had spent 50 years building half the skyline my late wife once prosecuted crime beneath. And I would have told you that nothing in this world frightens a man more than watching his own mind seem to fail him. Nothing, that is, until he learns his mind was never the thing that failed him at all. Before I tell you what happened in that tower, I want you to understand exactly how far a person you love can walk into darkness while wearing the face of someone who loves you back. Certain names and details in this account have been adjusted, but everything that matters in it is true, and I promise you it is worth staying for. The house was too quiet at 3 in the afternoon, and that was the first thing that frightened me. I had lived in this house for 41 years. I had poured its foundation myself, back when I was young enough to believe that a well-built structure could outlast every kind of ruin. I knew the particular silence of every room, the hush of the library when the furnace kicked on, the hollow stillness of the dining room after the housekeeper left for the day. But the silence that afternoon in the study was different. It had a shape to it. It pressed against my chest the way water presses against a diving bell, and I stood in the middle of that pressure with my hands shaking, staring at an empty drawer, trying to remember where I had put Clara's blueprint. It was not just any drawing. It was the one Clara had commissioned for our 40th anniversary, a hand-inked rendering of the very first house I ever designed, the little bungalow on Winthrop Street, where we had started our life together with nothing but a drafting table and each other. She had framed it herself. She had hung it in this study with her own hands, laughing at how crooked the nail went in, insisting she would fix it later and never once getting around to it. And she had told me, only half joking, that if the house ever burned down, I was to save that drawing before I saved anything else, including her. I used to tell her that was a terrible thing to make a man promise. She used to tell me that was exactly why she'd made me promise it. I had stood in front of that empty space on the wall for a full minute before I even opened the drawer, certain at first that I had simply moved it myself and forgotten. That was the shape terror took those days, not a sudden lightning strike of fear, but a slow, creeping suspicion of my own certainty, arriving in small doses, until I no longer trusted anything I remembered doing. 3 years since Clara died. 3 years, and I still could not walk past that drawing without stopping. And now it was gone. I searched the drawer twice, 3 times. My hands moved through old letters and rolled documents, and the small clutter of a life that had accumulated for 4 decades. And I felt something rising in my throat that had no name, not panic exactly, but its close and ugly cousin. I could hear my own breath going ragged. I pressed my palm flat against the desk to steady myself and thought, with a horror that felt almost physical, I have lost it. I have lost the one thing she asked me to protect. Dad? Thomas stood in the doorway. He had a way of appearing in doorways that I had noticed more and more over the past year, never quite announcing himself, simply arriving, the way a shadow arrives when a cloud passes. He was 40 years old and looked, as he always looked, immaculate, a gray cashmere sweater, the easy, patient smile of a man who has never once had to raise his voice to get what he wants. I can't find your mother's blueprint, I said. My voice came out thinner than I intended. I had it right here. I know I had it right here. Thomas crossed the room without hurrying. He knelt beside the very drawer I had already searched 3 times, reached into it, and withdrew the rolled drawing, still wrapped in its brown paper sleeve, as though it had been sitting there all along in plain sight. Right where you left it, Dad, he said gently. I stared at the drawing in his hands. I stared at the drawer. Something in my chest folded in on itself. I looked there, Thomas. I looked in that exact drawer. I know you did. He set the drawing carefully on the desk and put his hand on my shoulder, and his voice took on the soft, patient register he used more and more with me lately. the register you might use with a frightened child or an aging dog. "You forgot to take your medicine again this morning, didn't you?" Dr. Holloway said this would happen. "The disease progresses faster than anyone wants it to, Dad. I know it's frightening. I know." The disease. Two words that had, over the past 8 months, come to define the borders of my entire existence. Early onset cognitive decline, the doctor had called it, in a voice full of professional sympathy, sitting across from me in an office I did not remember choosing, prescribing pills the color of a summer sky that I was to take twice daily without fail. It had begun, as I remembered it, with small things: a misplaced appointment, a name that slipped away mid-sentence, the ordinary forgetfulness of a man well past 70. Thomas had been the one to suggest the specialist. Thomas had been the one to drive me to that first appointment, sitting beside me in the waiting room with his hand resting on my shoulder, telling me not to be afraid, that whatever we found, we would face it together. I had believed him completely. That, I think, was the cruelest part of all of it, not the drugs themselves, but how thoroughly, how lovingly he had made me grateful for them. I looked at my own hands. They were trembling. They were always trembling now, a fine, persistent tremor that had crept into my fingers sometime last winter and never left. I looked at the drawer I knew I had searched. I looked at my son's kind, patient, endlessly understanding face, and somewhere beneath the fear, in a place I did not yet have language for, something small and stubborn refused to believe him. That night I began writing things down. Every conversation, every instruction from the doctor, every place I set my keys, my glasses, my wallet. I bought a leather notebook from the drugstore, and I filled its pages with the careful, deliberate handwriting of a structural engineer who had spent his whole career believing that if you documented something precisely enough, it could not be taken from you. Within a week, the notebook was gone. Within 2 weeks, the second notebook I bought had 4 pages torn cleanly from its spine, the very pages, I was almost certain, where I had written down the date and the exact wording of what Dr. Holloway had said in our last appointment. I told myself I was misplacing things. I told myself the fog in my head was thickening, just as Thomas said it would. Dr. Holloway had used that exact word, thickening, in the appointment I had written down. Before that page, too, disappeared. I told myself all of this because the alternative, that someone in my own house was reaching into my mind and rearranging what I believed to be true, was a thought too large and too monstrous to hold on to for more than a few seconds at a time. I had built structures that stood through hurricanes. I did not yet know how to build a defense against a son who smiled while he dismantled me one drawer, one page, one gentle correction at a time. There were nights I woke at 3 a.m, convinced I had heard someone moving through the study below, and lay rigid in the dark, too frightened to go and look, because some small animal part of me had already begun to understand, before the rest of me could admit it, that I did not entirely trust what I would find. It was the piano tuner who changed everything. He came on a Tuesday, an elderly man with clouded, sightless eyes and the unhurried, listening hands of someone who had spent a lifetime learning the world through touch rather than sight. Clara's piano, a Steinway she had played every evening for 30 years, had sat untouched and slowly going out of tune since her death, and I had finally, guiltily, called someone to service it. His name, he told me, was Walter. He worked alone, moved through the house without a cane, without hesitation, and without ever once looking toward the small camera Thomas had installed above the study door 8 months ago. The one, Thomas said, was for my safety, in case I wandered, in case I fell. I found myself watching him the way you watch someone who seems, without ever announcing it, to know a house better than you expect a stranger to know it. He ran his fingers along the piano's edge before he ever touched a key, the way a man might read the spine of a book before opening it. He did not ask me where the fuse box was when the hallway light flickered. He simply moved toward it. I watched him work for nearly 2 hours. He did not speak much. When he finished, he packed his tools with the same slow, careful precision, and as I walked him to the front door, he took my hand in both of his. A courtesy, I assumed, an old man's parting gesture to another old man. But his grip did not let go, and when it opened again, there was something small pressed into my palm, a tiny scroll of paper, no bigger than a cigarette, wrapped tightly in a scrap of clear nylon. "She said this is only for the one who builds foundations," he murmured, so quietly that I nearly missed it beneath the sound of the closing door. Then he was down the front steps and into a waiting car, and he was gone, and I was standing alone in my own foyer with my heart slamming against my ribs and something in my closed fist that felt absurdly like it might be the only true thing left in my entire house. I did not open it there. Some old instinct, some structural engineer's sense of load-bearing risk told me to wait until I was alone with the door locked. I went to my study, sat at the desk, and unrolled the nylon with fingers that had stopped shaking for the first time in months. Not because the tremor was gone, but because whatever was happening in my chest had become larger and more urgent than fear. Inside was a single strip of paper, and on it, in handwriting I would have known if I were blind myself, if I were 100 years dead, if the whole world had forgotten every other fact it ever held. Clara's handwriting. "Arthur, your mind is not broken. Stop taking the blue pills. Go to the old woodshop on the outskirts. Don't let Thomas know." I sat in that study for a long time after I read it. I read it 4 times, 5 times, until the words no longer looked like words at all, only shapes, only the ghost of my dead wife's hand moving across paper that had somehow, impossibly, found its way into my own. I turned the strip of paper over, searching the blank side for anything else, some date, some explanation, and found nothing, only the small, deliberate economy of a woman who had never in 38 years wasted a single word she did not need. Clara had been gone for 3 years. I had stood at her grave in the rain. I had scattered dirt onto a casket with my own 2 hands, and I had told myself, in the raw months that followed, that grief was simply a debt. A man paid slowly for the privilege of having loved someone completely. And yet here, undeniably, in ink that had not faded, in the particular left-leaning slant she'd never lost since our engineering school days, here was her voice, telling me that I was not losing my mind at all, telling me that someone else was taking it from me on purpose. I did not sleep. I sat at that desk until the window went from black to gray, turning the little strip of nylon over and over in my hands like a man turning over a coin he does not yet dare to spend. And somewhere beneath the fear, something else had begun, quietly, to take root. Not hope exactly, not yet, but its foundation. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark beside the space where Clara used to sleep, and I thought about 8 months of trembling hands and disappearing notebooks, and a son who arrived in doorways like a shadow arrives. And by morning I had made a decision that felt, in the gray early light, both terrifying and entirely clear. I would stop taking the pills. I simply would not tell anyone I had stopped. Thomas brought them to me himself each morning, a small ritual he had established not long after Clara's funeral, standing beside my chair at the breakfast table with a glass of water, and that same patient, watching smile, waiting until I swallowed. I learned over the following days to hold the pill beneath my tongue, to sip the water, to let him see me swallow, and then, alone in the bathroom minutes later, to spit the small blue capsule into a tissue and flush it away. The first morning I did it, my hands shook so badly with fear that I nearly dropped the capsule on the tile, certain some hidden camera would catch the sound of it striking porcelain. No camera did. I had checked twice the day before, running my hands along every molding in that bathroom the way I once ran my hands along a load-bearing wall, testing for what did not belong. By the second day I noticed I was hungrier than I had been in months, and that the hunger itself felt like a strange, unfamiliar gift. By the second day, my hands had stopped shaking in the mornings, though I forced them to tremble whenever Thomas was watching. By the third day, something extraordinary happened. The fog I had lived inside for 8 months, the low, gray, cottony fog that made simple words slip out of reach, that made me forget which room I was walking toward halfway across the hall, simply lifted. I woke with a clarity I had not felt since before Clara's death. My hands, when I held them up in the bathroom mirror, were as steady as they had been at 50. I was not sick. I had never been sick. I had been drugged, carefully, deliberately, methodically drugged, into believing my own mind had betrayed me. The rage that moved through me in that bathroom was unlike anything I had felt in my 72 years of life. It was cold, and it was total, and beneath it, quieter, but no less enormous, was grief. Grief for 8 months of terror, 8 months of believing I was disappearing from the inside out, 8 months during which my own son had stood in doorways and watched me suffer with a face full of tender concern. On the fourth day, I told Thomas I wanted to take a walk alone, to clear my head. He hesitated. I saw the hesitation, small and precise, cross his face before the patient smile reassembled itself. And then he agreed, on the condition that I take my phone, that I stay within the neighborhood, that I be back before dark. I did not stay within the neighborhood. I drove instead to the old woodshop on the outskirts of the city, the one Clara and I had bought together decades ago, back when she still dabbled in furniture restoration on the weekends, back before the practice of law, and then, eventually, the U.S. Attorney's Office had consumed every hour of her considerable energy. We had not set foot in that shop together in 15 years. I was not certain it would even still be standing. It was standing, dust-covered, cobwebbed, smelling of cedar and old varnish, exactly as I remembered it. I stood in the doorway for a long moment before I understood why Clara would have sent me here, of all places. Because it was the one place in either of our lives that Thomas had never once thought to look. The one corner of our history that belonged entirely to us and not to him. He had grown up visiting his mother's law offices and my construction sites. He had never once, in 40 years, asked to see this shop, and I understood now, standing in its dust, that his indifference to it had been the very thing that made it safe. I ran my hand along the workbench Clara had refinished herself one long-ago summer, and for a moment the grief of missing her was so total and so physical that I had to sit down on an overturned crate and simply breathe. It took me nearly an hour to find the loose floorboard. I might never have found it at all if I had not, in some distant part of my memory, recalled laying that very floor myself 40 years ago, and recalled, with the sudden, sharpened clarity that comes only from true expertise, that I had left one section unglued on purpose, in case the old pipe beneath it ever needed servicing. Beneath the board was a steel box. Inside the box were two things that would end, forever, the version of my life I had been living for 8 months. The first was a folder of my own medical records. Real medical records, not the ones Thomas's private doctor had filed with the court, but records from an independent neurologist Clara had apparently arranged for me to see, quietly, without my knowledge, sometime in the year before she died. Full cognitive assessment, full neurological workup. The conclusion, typed in clean clinical language across the final page, was unambiguous. Patient exhibits no signs of cognitive impairment, dementia, or neurological decline. Full mental capacity confirmed. I sat down hard on the dusty workbench, the paper trembling in my hands. Trembling for real now from something other than any drug. Full mental capacity confirmed. 3 words that, 8 months ago, would have meant nothing more to me than an unremarkable line in an unremarkable file. Now they felt like the only sentence in the English language capable of holding the weight of everything that had been done to me. The second item in the box was a set of files belonging to Clara, private, meticulous, the same obsessive precision she had brought to every case she'd ever prosecuted in 30 years as a federal attorney. Bank statements, emails, a copy of a medical power of attorney document bearing my signature, a signature I did not recognize as my own, dated 18 months before Clara's death, granting Thomas full authority over my medical decisions in the event I was ever determined to be of diminished capacity. I understood, reading it, exactly how the mechanism had worked. Thomas had used that power of attorney to compel a compromised physician, Dr. Holloway, whose name appeared again and again throughout Clara's files, alongside wire transfers I had no memory of authorizing, to prescribe medication that mimicked the outward symptoms of dementia. Tremors, fog, memory lapses just severe enough to be plausible, never so severe as to require hospitalization. The purpose, laid out in Clara's own careful annotations across a stack of corporate documents, was almost elegant in its cruelty. With me declared incapacitated, Thomas would gain full control of Vance Architectural Group, the firm I had spent 50 years building, the firm whose name and reputation had guaranteed the structural integrity of luxury developments across 3 states. He intended to use that reputation, my reputation, to certify a string of high-rise luxury condominium projects being built, according to Clara's notes, with deliberately substandard skimmed materials, the cost difference laundered through a network of shell contractors tied to organized crime. My name on the permits, my signature on the safety certifications. An old man's unimpeachable 50-year legacy used as a shield for a criminal enterprise that would collapse buildings full of people the moment cheap steel met a heavy winter storm. I thought of every ribbon cutting I'd ever attended for one of Thomas's developments, every photograph of myself shaking hands beside a gleaming new lobby, my name engraved on a cornerstone I had never actually inspected. I had believed in each of those moments that I was watching my son honor a legacy. I had been instead watching him spend it. Clara's notes traced the money forward and backward with a prosecutor's relentless patience. Invoices for structural steel that never arrived at the sites they were billed to, inspection reports signed by inspectors who did not exist, wire transfers routed through 4 countries before settling finally into accounts controlled by men whose names I did not recognize, but whose presence, even on paper, made the hair rise on my arms. I found Clara's diary at the very bottom of the box, and it was there that the grief finally broke me open completely. She had discovered the first thread of it 3 years ago, a discrepancy in a permit filing that no one else would have noticed, the kind of anomaly only a former federal prosecutor's eye would catch. She had begun quietly to pull the thread. Bank records, corporate filings. She had suspected, she wrote, that Thomas was involved with dangerous people, and she had been building a case, methodically, secretly, the way she had built every case in her career, intending to bring it to the FBI once she had enough to make it stick. The final entry was dated 4 days before her death. I am close now. I think I finally have enough. I am frightened for the first time in this entire process, not for myself, but for what happens to Arthur if I am wrong about how far Thomas is willing to go. I will call Elena tomorrow. 4 days later, my wife of 38 years had collapsed in this very study with what every doctor in the room called, unanimously, a massive and sudden stroke. I sat alone in that dusty woodshop, surrounded by the wreckage of everything I had believed about the last 3 years of my life, and I understood with a clarity more devastating than any drug-induced fog that my son had not only stolen my mind, he had very likely murdered my wife. I do not know how long Thomas had suspected. Perhaps he had known from the first day I stopped swallowing the pills. Perhaps some flicker of steadiness in my hands, some too sharp clarity in my eyes across the breakfast table had told him before I ever said a word. What I know is that on the 7th evening after I found the steel box, I came downstairs to find every door in the house locked, from a keypad system I did not recognize, Installed, apparently, sometime that afternoon, while I had been upstairs in the study, and Thomas standing in the front hallway with his hands folded and a smile that no longer bothered pretending to be gentle. "You stopped taking your medicine," he said. It was not a question. There seemed to be no purpose left in denial. "I never needed it," I said. "I know what you did to me, Thomas. I know what you did to your mother." Something in his face shifted then. Not shock, not guilt, but a kind of relief. The relief of a man setting down a heavy mask he was tired of holding up. "Mother was going to destroy everything I built," he said evenly, as though explaining a business decision to a colleague who simply hadn't yet grasped the logic of it. "You were going to be the collateral damage of her righteousness, Dad. I was protecting you from that. I was protecting the family name. You were protecting yourself." He did not argue the point. He simply glanced at his phone, and something about that small, unhurried gesture frightened me more than anything he had said. "There's a facility in Wisconsin," he said. "Private. Very comfortable. You'll be well cared for, Dad. It's really for the best, given your condition. Given your condition." Even now, even with the mask off, he was still narrating the story he intended the world to believe, and I understood, listening to him, that he would go on narrating it long after I was gone, to the neighbors, to the firm's board, to whatever version of Sarah he still believed he could manage. The story would outlive the truth for as long as he was allowed to keep telling it. I did not wait to hear the rest. 50 years of designing buildings had taught me things about this house that no locksmith, no keypad system, no amount of Thomas's careful planning had ever accounted for. I had built a service hatch into the guest bedroom closet decades ago, back when the house still had a coal chute running beneath it, sealed since but never removed, a narrow, forgotten passage that led down into the crawl space and out through a grate behind the garden shed, a detail so old and so trivial that I doubted even I would have remembered it had I not spent 50 years training myself never to forget the bones of a structure. I went through that passage in the dark, on hands and knees that had not knelt on cold concrete in 30 years, feeling my way along a wall I had poured myself half a century ago, my palms remembering the seams and joints before my eyes could make sense of the darkness at all. Somewhere above me I heard Thomas's raised voice, muffled through 2 floors of concrete, calling my name with an urgency that had finally, entirely, dropped the pretense of gentleness. I came up through the grate, behind the shed, into an October night, thick with the smell of dying leaves, and I ran. I do not know exactly when the silver alert began. I first understood what had happened when I ducked, breathless, into a 24-hour diner 4 miles from the house and saw my own face, an old photograph taken at some fundraiser 2 years back. Thomas must have supplied it, filling the screen above the counter. Silver alert. Arthur Vance, 72, missing from Lakeshore residence, believed to be suffering from advanced cognitive decline, may be confused, disoriented, and a danger to himself. Family requests public assistance in locating him. It was, I understood in that instant, a masterstroke of cruelty disguised as mercy. Thomas had not called the police to hunt a fugitive. He had summoned an entire city to rescue a helpless old man, through, I would later learn, a Chicago police lieutenant on Thomas's payroll who had pushed the alert through every highway sign, every phone, every local news ticker within an hour of my escape. I was no longer simply a man trying to reach the truth. I had become, in the space of that single hour, the object of a manhunt conducted entirely in the language of compassion. Every stranger who glanced twice at me on the street was not a threat. They were a citizen doing their civic duty, watching for a confused old man to gently return to his loving, worried son. No one, I understood with rising horror, would believe a word I said. A man reported to be suffering dementia, telling strangers on the street that his own son had poisoned him and murdered his wife. It would sound, to any ordinary listener, like exactly the kind of confused, tragic delusion the alert had warned them to expect. I moved through the city for 6 hours that night, the way a hunted animal moves. Doorway to doorway, alley to alley, ducking beneath the amber wash of streetlights that had once simply been beautiful and were now nothing but exposure. My phone, still in my coat pocket, buzzed continuously with alerts, and twice with calls from a number I did not recognize that I did not dare answer. Twice, patrol cars slowed as they passed me, and twice I forced myself into the shadow of a doorway and held my breath until the taillights receded. Once, a young couple walking a dog stopped directly beneath the street lamp nearest me, phones raised, comparing my face on their screens to whatever they could make out of me in the dark. And I turned and walked the other way, with my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears, certain that the very kindness in their voices, "We should call someone, he might be scared," was the thing most likely to end everything I had left to do. By 4 a.m, exhaustion had begun to make the decision for me that fear had not. I was going to be caught, sooner or later, by someone with far less patience than a stranger, and handed directly back into Thomas's custody, after which no steel box, no diary, no truth would ever reach the light again. It was in an alley behind a shuttered hardware store, cornered by the beam of an approaching flashlight, that a woman's voice, low, urgent, entirely unlike the practiced sympathy of the Silver Alert broadcasts, said my name. "Mr. Vance, Arthur Vance. My name is Elena Rostova. I'm a federal agent. Your wife contacted my office 18 months before she died. I need you to trust me for the next 10 seconds, because after that, I promise, I can explain everything." I looked at the badge she held up in the flashlight's glow, and at the steady, unhurried certainty in her eyes, and something in my chest, battered, exhausted, and hunted nearly past the point of reason, finally, cautiously, allowed itself to believe that I had at last found someone on Clara's side of the truth. The safe house was a modest brick 2-flat on a quiet street I did not recognize. Its windows covered, its interior sparse and functional in the particular way of a place built for necessity rather than comfort. Elena Rostova sat across a scarred kitchen table from me with a laptop open between us, and for the first hour I said almost nothing at all, because everything she told me required more room in my chest than I had available. "Your wife did not die of a stroke," Elena said. "Thomas hired a man to poison her. The compound used mimics stroke symptoms almost perfectly if you're not specifically looking for it, and the hospital wasn't looking for it because no one had any reason to suspect a woman like Clara Vance. I do not remember making a sound. I remember only that my hands, flat on the table, had gone entirely white at the knuckles. "But she's alive," Elena said, and let the words sit there, unhurried, giving me time to absorb them before she continued. "Our medical team reached her in time. It was close, closer than I'm comfortable telling you in detail right now, but she survived. And once she survived, we had a choice to make. If Thomas learned she was alive, he would finish what he started, and this time he wouldn't be careless about it. If we protected her in any conventional way, police protection, a new address on record somewhere, anything a determined man with the right contacts could eventually trace. Thomas's reach through Holloway, through his police contacts, through the sheer resources of the laundering operation he was helping run, would have found her within months. We had watched him make people disappear before, Mr. Vance, quietly, efficiently. We were not going to hand him a second chance at your wife." "So you buried her," I said. My voice did not sound like my own. "We buried a fabricated medical record and a fabricated death certificate," Elena said. "Witness protection, Mr. Vance. Full relocation, full identity restructuring. As far as any document that exists anywhere in this country is concerned, Clara Vance died 3 years ago. Even Thomas believes that. He has believed it genuinely this entire time. He thinks his mother's death was the stroke of luck that let him move forward with everything else." I put my face in my hands and I wept. Then, in a way I had not permitted myself since the funeral, Not for grief this time, but for something far more complicated, a wound and a resurrection arriving in the same breath. It was cruelly only minutes later that the second call came through. Elena's phone rang, and I watched her expression change. The careful, controlled shift of a professional absorbing bad news in real time. She turned the screen toward me. It was a live local news broadcast. A reporter standing outside a gleaming glass tower downtown. The chyron beneath her reading, "Grand opening delayed at Vance Smart Tower amid family emergency." "Your daughter," Elena said quietly. Sarah, my youngest, the one who had spent her whole life just slightly out of the frame of every family photograph, the daughter whose achievements had always seemed to arrive a half-beat too late to catch anyone's attention, overshadowed always by her brother's easy brilliance. An independent interior designer, gentle and sharp-eyed in equal measure, who had, I would learn over the following hour, pieced together from Elena's contacts inside the building's staff, stumbled entirely by accident onto a financial discrepancy in the books for the Smart Tower project while consulting on its penthouse interiors. She had noticed, apparently, that an invoice for imported marble did not match the stone actually being installed 2 floors above her, and being Sarah, being the daughter who noticed things no one else in this family had ever thought to look for, she had pulled the thread rather than let it go. A discrepancy that, once pulled, unraveled directly into the laundering network her mother had died trying to expose. Thomas had detained her inside the tower itself, in an office 40 floors above the street, hours before its billion-dollar grand opening. My phone, the one I had left behind in my desperate flight from the house, and which Elena's team had apparently since recovered and quietly monitored, buzzed with an incoming call from a blocked number. Elena nodded once, and I answered it on speaker. "Dad?" Thomas's voice was calm, almost cheerful, the voice of a man discussing a minor scheduling conflict. "I understand you've made some new friends. That's fine. I want you to listen carefully, though, because I only intend to explain this once." I said nothing. My jaw was locked too tight to speak. "Your daughter is with me," Thomas continued. "She's perfectly comfortable for now. Whether that continues is entirely up to you. I need the original files. Whatever Mother left you, the diary, the medical records, all of it. Bring them to me personally tonight, before the opening ceremony, and Sarah walks out of this building unharmed. Involve your new federal friends, and I promise you, Dad, you will spend the rest of your life understanding exactly what that decision cost you." The line went dead. I looked at Elena across that scarred kitchen table, and I felt something settle in my chest that was neither fear nor grief, but the same cold, deliberate clarity I had once brought to 50 years of structural calculations, a clarity that understood with total certainty that I was the only person alive who knew every hidden bone of the building my son now stood inside. "I designed that tower's original systems," I said, 20 years ago, before Thomas gutted and rebuilt it into whatever glass fortress it is now. There's a way in that has nothing to do with his digital security. And I am the only person on Earth who still knows where it is. The Vance Smart Tower rose 42 stories above the river, sheathed in glass and touchless biometric locks, its every entrance guarded by facial recognition scanners and an AI monitoring system Thomas had spent 3 years and a small fortune installing. Elena's team studied the building's schematics for 2 hours and arrived each time at the same grim conclusion. Any conventional breach, armed entry, a hacked override, even a simple forced door, would trigger an automatic lockdown, and more dangerously, the document destruction protocol Thomas had built into the server room on the 38th floor, the same floor where Sarah was being held. "If we go in loud," Elena said, "he burns every piece of evidence we have before we're through the lobby doors. And there's no guarantee your daughter survives the panic that follows." She tapped the schematic in front of her, at the 38th floor. His security firm rebuilt this entire building around a single principle. Nothing gets in or out without his system knowing about it first. Facial recognition at every entrance, biometric locks on every internal door, an AI monitoring layer that flags anything it doesn't recognize within seconds. It's a fortress built entirely out of code, and code is the one language none of us can walk through unnoticed. I sat with the tower's floor plans spread across the table and felt something rise in me that was not quite hope, but was close enough to stand in for it. "You won't need to go in loud," I said. "You'll need to go in quiet, and I'm the only one who can open the door." 20 years before Thomas's renovation, this tower had been a very different building, and I had been its structural engineer of record. Buried 3 levels beneath the glittering lobby Thomas had built on top of it was the original mechanical core, the analog hydraulic fire suppression and structural fail-safe system I had designed with my own hands, entirely independent of any electrical grid, untouched by fiber optics or facial recognition, precisely because the fire code of that era demanded a system that could function even if every modern circuit in the building failed at once. Thomas, in his eagerness to build a fortress of glass and code, had never once thought to decommission it. Why would he? It was invisible to him. It existed entirely outside the only language he understood. I walked into the building alone, through the front doors, in full view of every camera in the lobby, and I did not try to hide. Thomas met me on the 38th floor, in an office of pale wood and floor-to-ceiling glass, with Sarah seated white-faced and silent in a chair by the window, a single guard standing near enough to make his intentions clear without ever needing to raise his voice. "You came alone," Thomas said, sounding almost disappointed. "I was hoping you'd bring the cavalry, Dad. I do so enjoy watching people underestimate me." "I brought what you asked for," I said, and set the steel box, its true contents replaced at Elena's instruction with decoys, on the desk between us. Thomas did not open it right away. He circled the desk instead slowly, and something in his voice shifted into a register I had never heard from him before. Not the practiced patience of the caretaker, not the cold efficiency of the businessman, but something raw and old and unguarded. "Do you have any idea what it was like," he said, "growing up as the son who was supposed to be great? Every dinner table, every school conference, every single conversation you and Mother ever had about my future, I could feel the weight of it before I even understood what the weight was. You built an entire empire out of nothing, Dad, and I was supposed to simply inherit the greatness, become it, as though greatness were something you could hand down like a wristwatch." He laughed, short and bitter. "I built something bigger than anything you ever designed. And you want to know the truth? I never once respected either of your precious moral foundations. Honesty, integrity, the whole sermon. It's a luxury for people who've already won." I looked at my son, genuinely looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years, and understood that I was looking at a wound that had calcified into something monstrous long before I had ever noticed it forming. "You had every advantage a young man could ask for," I said. "A firm with your name already on the door. A mother who believed in you before you'd earned a single reason for it. And you built a fortress out of it, Thomas. And you filled the fortress with stolen steel. Your mother built her whole life on that foundation," I said quietly. "And you tried to have her murdered for it." Something flickered across his face. Not remorse, I don't think, but perhaps the closest thing to it that Thomas was still capable of producing. And in that fraction of a second, while he stood absorbed in his own justification, gesturing toward the gleaming digital panel that controlled every lock, every camera, every inch of his fortress of glass, I shifted my weight onto my left heel. Sewn into the trim of my shoe, exactly where I had built it that morning, with hands that had not lost a single ounce of their old precision, was a small mechanical trigger, a physical override, wired directly through a maintenance shaft only I still remembered into the analog pressure valve buried 3 floors beneath us. I pressed down. Somewhere far below, a valve I had installed 20 years ago turned for the first time in 2 decades. The building's original fail-safe system, dormant and forgotten, and entirely beyond the reach of anything digital, roared to life. Every steel security door on the 38th floor slammed downward in a single deafening cascade, sealing every exit at once, and in the same instant every screen in Thomas's gleaming office, the biometric panel, the camera feeds, the server displays, went dark, disabled by an emergency protocol that predated every line of code he had ever written into this building. Thomas stood frozen in the sudden red wash of the emergency lighting, staring at his own dead panel with an expression I had never once seen on my son's face. Utter total disbelief. The FBI came up through the ventilation shafts within 90 seconds. Elena had positioned her team in the maintenance corridors the moment I confirmed the fail-safe's location, waiting only for the building's electronic defenses to fall. Thomas's single guard put his hands up before anyone even raised a weapon toward him. Thomas himself did not resist so much as simply stop. Whatever engine had powered his composure for 40 years seemed to run entirely out of fuel in the space of that red-lit minute, and he sank into the chair behind his own desk and said nothing at all. Sarah reached me before the agents had finished clearing the room. She crossed the office in 3 steps and wrapped both arms around me so tightly I felt her shaking through my coat, her breath coming in the short, ragged pulls of someone who had spent hours holding terror at arm's length by sheer will alone. And I held my daughter, my youngest, my overlooked, my brave and sharp-eyed girl who had stumbled into a truth no one else had thought to hand her, and I said the only thing I had left in me to say. "I've got you. You're safe now." It was the sound of the door at the far end of the office opening that made Thomas's head come up. She walked in the way she had always walked into every room of our life together. Without hesitation, without apology, her chin level, her eyes finding her son's across the width of the office with a steadiness that made the entire space go silent around her. "Clara." Thomas's mouth opened. No sound came out for a long moment, and when it finally did, it was not a word at all. It was a single broken syllable, the sound of a man watching the floor of his own reality give way beneath him all at once. He had spent 3 years believing with total and unquestioning certainty that his mother's death was the one clean, uncomplicated thing he had gotten away with. And now she stood in the doorway of his own tower, alive, watching him with an expression that held no triumph in it at all, only a vast and terrible sorrow. Whatever remained of the perfect, composed mask Thomas had worn his entire adult life did not merely crack in that moment. It came apart completely, collapsing into something raw and stammering and entirely unrecognizable as the son I had raised. He shrank back against the desk as though the very sight of her might reach across the room and take hold of him, and for one unbearable second I saw beneath the ruin of him the small boy he must once have been, before ambition and envy and whatever else had hollowed him out had ever had the chance. I did not go to Clara first. I want to be honest about that, because it was not the reunion either of us had imagined in 3 years of separate grief. I stood where I was, several feet away, and I let my eyes find hers. And what rose in me was not simply joy. It was 3 years of grief and 3 years of terror and 8 months of believing my own mind had betrayed me, all of it arriving at once. And beneath all of it, a hurt so old and so deep that my legs would not carry me toward her until I had said it aloud. 3 years, Clara, I said, and my voice broke on her name. 3 years I sat on that porch believing my mind was dying, believing you had left me behind. Her eyes filled, and for a moment she did not try to hide it. "If you had known I was alive," she said, "your strength would have given us away, Arthur. Thomas was monitoring your heart rate, your sleep, everything he could reach. I had to let you break. truly break, because only then would the surveillance he kept on you look convincing enough that he'd never suspect I was still building the case that would end him. I turned our love into bait. I am so sorry. The anger that had carried me through 6 hours of hunted flight and a night spent designing a mechanical trap inside my own son's fortress did not vanish all at once. But it moved slowly into something larger and softer and infinitely more painful. A grief not for myself any longer, but for the woman who had spent 3 years in the particular, unbearable loneliness of loving someone from a distance she was not permitted to close. I crossed the room and I held my wife, and she held me back with a strength I remembered from 38 years of marriage, and somewhere behind us, Sarah was crying quietly. And somewhere in front of us, federal agents were reading Thomas his rights in the flat, procedural cadence of people who had done this many times before. And none of it, not one particle of it, mattered as much in that moment as the simple fact that Clara's arms were real and warm and finally, after 3 unbearable years, exactly where they belonged. The trial took 4 months to reach its conclusion. I sat in that courtroom every day I was permitted to, and Clara sat beside me, her hand in mine, both of us watching a son and a mother's child be reduced, sentence by sentence, into a matter of federal record. Thomas was convicted on charges that filled 2 full pages of the indictment: fraud, conspiracy, attempted murder, money laundering on a scale the prosecutors described more than once as staggering. The judge sentenced him to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Dr. Holloway lost his license and was sentenced separately for his role in the scheme. The corrupt police lieutenant, who had weaponized my own city's compassion against me, resigned in disgrace before his own indictment could be finalized, and the laundering network Thomas had helped run collapsed within weeks, its shell companies unwound one by federal auditors who, Elena told me with something close to pride, had Clara's original 3-year-old files to thank for most of the roadmap. I did not feel triumph when the verdict was read. I felt mostly exhausted, and beneath the exhaustion, a grief with no clean edges to it at all. For the son I had raised, and for the man he had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to become instead. It was Sarah who sat beside me every day of that trial. It was Sarah who drove Clara to her follow-up medical appointments in those first uncertain months of her return. Sarah who quietly, patiently rebuilt the small daily architecture of a family that had nearly been destroyed. My youngest daughter, the one who had spent her whole life a half-step behind her brother's brightness, had become, without either of us ever quite deciding it, the steady center around which the rest of us learned to stand again. Clara saw it too, and one evening in early autumn, sitting across from me at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold between her hands, she said something I do not think she had ever allowed herself to say aloud before. I spent so many years making sure Thomas had every advantage, every opportunity, every ounce of encouragement I could give him, she said. And I never once noticed how much warmth I left over for Sarah until it was very nearly too late to give it back. I did not have an answer for her. Some wounds I have learned are not meant to be answered, only witnessed and carried forward differently. We sat together on the front porch of the old house one Sunday afternoon in late October, the same porch where I had spent 3 years believing my own mind was slipping away from me, and I looked down at my hands resting on my knees. They were steady, perfectly, entirely steady, for the first time in longer than I could clearly remember. Clara reached over and took one of them in hers, her thumb tracing absently across my knuckles, the way it had for 38 years before any of this began. "We made it," she said. Sarah came out onto the porch a few minutes later with 3 mugs of coffee balanced carefully between her hands, and set one down beside each of us without a word, and settled into the wicker chair across from ours with the easy, unhurried belonging of a daughter who had finally, after a lifetime of standing at the edges of this family, found her way to its very center. I looked at my wife, alive and beside me, and exactly herself. And out at the yard where the maple trees were shedding their leaves in slow amber spirals across the grass, and I understood finally the shape of everything the last year had tried to teach me. Love is not the quiet covering up of a child's sins simply because they share your blood. Love sometimes is standing in the wreckage of a foundation you built with your own hands, and finding within yourself the courage to tear it down, so that the people who remain, the people who are left standing in the dust and the daylight afterward, can finally build something true. If this story reached something in you, I hope you will carry it forward to someone who needs to hear it. Pay close attention to the ones you love most, and to the quiet, patient way betrayal can wear a familiar and gentle face. I believe still, after everything, that the truth does not stay buried forever. It only waits for someone patient enough and loved enough to go looking for it.